Hi, Gerhard Bloom here, once again looking at the tyranny and the delusions of the social justice movement. So today I'd like to look at this apocalyptic narrative of this looming environmental catastrophe, and unless we act immediately, absolute catastrophe, right? Global warming is an existential crisis. We need to act with absolute urgency. Well, as with much of the leftist rhetoric, this is complete hysterical nonsense. Spoke of several books, Sullenberger's Apocalypse Never, and the book The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, and I've recently gone through Unsettled, right? What climate science tells us, what it doesn't, why it matters. Stephen E. Koonin. And this is, that last book is probably the most authoritative title of the books that I've read, because Stephen E. Koonin was the Undersecretary for Science under Obama. And at the time he took his post, he, as much of you, was convinced that this narrative, there had to be some truth in the matter, right? And he's a physicist, so he's an actual scientist, right? Not like, gender studies PhDs, right? No, he's a real scientist. And he pulled together a panel of experts. And lest you condemn his statements as not being a climate scientist, well, the fact of the matter is, climate science is constructed around experts in various scientific fields, serious science, pulling together disparate lines of inquiry, because it turns out studying science, environment, and the various impacts that produce climate is a very, very complex matter. It is not as though you can be a climate scientist, right? You could be an expert consulting the various fields and develop an expertise in the matter, as Mr. Koonin did. So he looked at various studies from across the board, consulted numerous experts. And here's some conclusions that he's found. So what climate science tells us today, right? The heat waves in the United States are now no more common than they were in 1900, right? In the year 1900, just as many heat waves, right? And the warmest temperatures in the United States have not risen in the past 50 years. Perhaps you didn't know that the worst climate-related disaster in American history was Galveston, Texas, in the year 1900. Over 8,000 people died, right? That is the worst climate-related disaster in the United States, the year 1900. So far less carbon emissions in the atmosphere. And another thing to consider is population densities, right? Population densities were much lower. So an 8,000 death toll is absolutely catastrophic. So he looked at the data, and here's some more conclusions that the actual science says. Humans have had no detectable impact on hurricanes over the past century. Greenland's ice sheets aren't shrinking any more rapidly than they were 80 years ago. The net impact of human-induced climate change will be minimal, at least through the end of the century. But what this apocalyptic narrative does is it drives politicians and international bodies into adopting absolutely terrible policies and attempting to coerce governments of the third world into adopting policies that will actually lead to catastrophe. I mentioned Sri Lanka, right? The government of Sri Lanka coerced farmers into adopting green green fertilizers, right? They wanted to go organic, right? It led to an absolute collapse in their agricultural output, and it led to the collapse of the government, right? Not before ruining the economy. Now, the government of Holland is trying to do the same with its farmers. It's absolutely insane. So, having been fed this apocalyptic narrative, no measure is too extreme, right? Well, there's no looming apocalypse except the one that the Dutch government will afflict on its farmers. And as I mentioned previously, and was a great surprise to me, Holland is the second largest agricultural producer in the world. So this will influence far more than the farmers of Holland. And as more and more governments around the world are coerced into adopting these, coerced or shamed by Greta Thunberg into adopting these harmful, deeply harmful, and unnecessary policies, millions could potentially starve to death. Perhaps you didn't know. You might think that, first world countries, the most polluting, the most dirty environmentally. Oh, no, absolute nonsense. The most polluting countries on the planet are third world countries. They're the dirtiest, they're the most polluting. And first world nations and international bodies want these countries to skip from burning cow dung and wood to go right to green energy. This would be a leap of absolute epic proportions. And in fact, it's an impossible leap because green energy, as the science currently stands, just does not scale. It's unreliable, it doesn't scale, and here's a surprising fact. About 1 million people in India each year. India, yes, it's a huge country. 1 million people die each year from indoor pollution. Why? Because they burn cow dung and wood, right? And they need fuel. The best way to reduce pollution is by getting third world countries up to first world standards. And you want to keep these people in absolute poverty and immiseration by forcing on them just ridiculous environmental policies that they can't pretend to live up to. This is shameful. These people, like you and I, we need reliable energy, cheap, reliable energy. This is fossil fuels. But the climate alarmists have been lying to you. There's some interesting quotes that Mr. Coonan was able to pull, where scholars were deliberately misrepresenting the facts, right? Because they can't trust you with the truth, because you just might not take this invented apocalypse seriously. So this is from Paul Watson, co-founder of Greenpeace. It doesn't matter what is true. It only matters that people believe it's true, right? Greenpeace, Paul Watson. Tom Worth, president of the UN Foundations. We've got to ride this global warming issue. Even if the theory of global warming is wrong, we will be doing the right thing in terms of economic and environmental policy, right? Tim Worth, president of the UN Foundation, right? Daniel Botkin, former chair of environmental studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara, right? He has some concerns here. Some colleagues who share some of my doubts argue the only way to get our society to change is to frighten people with the possibility of catastrophe, and that therefore it is all right and even necessary for scientists to exaggerate. They tell me that belief in open, honest assessment is naive. Right? Absolutely terrible. And here's more sources that Coonan pulls, right? This now from the media. Inactionable cause, by the turn of the century, this was the year 2000, an ecological catastrophe which will witness devastation as complete and as irreversible as any nuclear holocaust, right? This was in 1982 by Mustafa Tolba, former executive director of the United Nations Environmental Program. Did you see any environmental catastrophe equal to a nuclear holocaust? No, that was 20 years ago, right? This is from David Vinner, senior research scientist in the year 2000. Within a few years, winter snowfall in the UK will become a rare and exciting event. Children just aren't going to know what snow is. That was 20 years ago. I think the children in Britain know what snow is, right? Paul Townsend and Paul Harris, quoting a Pentagon report in The Guardian 2004. European cities will be plunged beneath rising seas as Britain is plunged into a Siberian climate by 2020. Well, it's 2020, didn't happen, right? This climate alarmism is dangerous, right? And it needs to stop. The third world nations need to get on fossil fuels as fast as possible, right? This will clean the environment. They will stop burning wood. They will stop burning cow dung, and they need lives of secure, cheap energy to fuel the economies, to lift them out of poverty, right? And we need cheap and abundant energy, right? The Midwest is projected to have rolling blackouts this summer, right? The Midwest. Perhaps you didn't know, the United States has the world's largest identifiable oil reserves in the world. Yes, more than Saudi Arabia, more than Venezuela, more than anywhere. And the United States produces the cleanest energy, right? The absolute cleanest energy, the United States. So why is the Midwest facing rolling blackouts? Climate alarmists. They shut down nuclear power plants. They shut down coal plants. So if you have one of these nice Tesla electric cars, where are you going to go when the rolling blackout hits? Right? Absolutely ridiculous. And it won't just be your Teslas that don't move, right? All the food that you have in your fridge and your freezers will spoil. And something more to consider. Little old ladies living in apartment buildings without air conditioning may die, right? May die. Here's a startling fact. In the last 100 years, there has been a 99% reduction. 99% reduction in climate-related deaths. Why is that? Because when it gets very cold outside, we turn on the heat. When it gets very hot, we turn on air conditioning. Perhaps you didn't know that there are significantly more numbers of people who die every year from the cold than from heat. That's right. Cold kills far more people than heat kills. But heat does kill. I had a beautiful day here in Toronto. It was very humid, about 26 degrees. I enjoyed the heat. T-shirts, shorts. At night, in an apartment, the heat doesn't abate. And for elderly people, this may kill them. But if they have air conditioning, they'll manage very, very well, right? We need cheap, reliable energy, and this green energy just does not scale as it currently is. And as far as green energy, a lot of this technology surrounding green energy requires rare earth minerals, right? Rare earth minerals, those lithium batteries that power these electric vehicles, rare earth minerals. Well, rare earth minerals is something of a misnomer. The minerals aren't in fact rare, but they are dispersed, right? They're dispersed. So to extract them, you need a soup of toxic chemicals to leach them and separate them. And in China, this is having huge ecological consequences. There are giant ponds of deadly, toxic chemicals so to get this clean energy. So it's not all that clean at all, and it's not reliable. Something more to consider. When you plug in your electric car, most of the energy that goes into your green car is based on fossil fuels, right? So you're not actually really going green, and there are second and third order effects in producing this green energy, right? So absolute nonsense. So, you hear that we're running out of fossil fuels, right? Running out of fossil fuels. Well, Thomas Sowell, right, the economist Thomas Sowell, looked at energy consumption during the first 2 decades of the 20th century and looked at the data, and we likely consumed in those first 2 decades of the 20th century more energy than was consumed in all of previous history. And this rose dramatically throughout the 20th century, right? And what happened to the known reserves of oil, right? Must be running out. Did they see a commensurate reduction, right? More oil use, drastically more oil use? No, actually, by the end of the century, the known reserves were 10 times as large as mid-century, right? And people had been predicting that you would run out of energy, right? We'd reach peak energy. So here's a quote. Running out of fossil fuels. The United States has only 13 years of domestic supply at current levels of use, right? 13 years of domestic supply at current use. This was written 50 years ago. And it was, it's a bestseller, right? Wow, this climate alarmism sells. So we must really be in rough shape, right? 50 years later. Well, except with Trump energy policies, the United States was producing energy at a surplus. The U.S., that had been previously dependent on foreign energy, as it is now, was energy independent. So there's much more fossil fuel use and much more of this allegedly exhausted supply. So somebody's lying to you here. Well, it's not me, right? The fact is that there is about 1,000 years of available fossil fuels in the earth. And as time goes by, and as the fossil fuels become more scarce, we will become ever more efficient in their use. In addition to which, there is nuclear energy, right? This is reliable. It is safe. It is extremely safe. My girlfriend and I saw Chernobyl, right? Chernobyl. Oh my God, how catastrophic. Lies. Greatly embellished. Really good series, right? Very interesting, compelling drama, but greatly exaggerated the impact of Chernobyl. And same, the Fukushima event, right? It was built in exactly the wrong place, but the level of emergency was, at the end of the day, minimal. Many more people. Coal mining is much more dangerous. So get on to nuclear is safe and reliable, and continue fossil fuel use, right? So peak oil, right? N. King Hubbard predicted in the 1960s that we would see in the year 2000 about 12.5 barrels of oil a year, peak oil, right? By the year 2000. Well, in the year 2016, the world's oil production wasn't 12.5 barrels. It was 29.4 billion barrels, right? So contrary to the green ideology, we will need fossil fuels for the foreseeable future, right? And, the the hysteria with which the politicians and international organizations are reacting to this will create absolute catastrophic consequences. Billions of people could die. There is no reason why the Midwest should be confronting rolling blackouts. And the droughts in California. California is a desert. They're running out of water. Why? Because they've been exceeding the use of the available water for decades now. There are simple solutions to this. Israel gets a significant portion of its water now from desalinization. Right? Guess what? California is on the ocean. Right? California is on the ocean, and climate alarmists refuse to open up desalinization plants. This can be done, right? There's no reason why California can't have fresh and abundant water. They can also start constructing pipelines of water from regions where water is much more accessible. Turns out there are much more problems with flooding in the world than there are with drought. So there's technical means of managing scarcity. Lest you think that, what about Hurricane Katrina? And what about the flooding in New Jersey? Isn't that, every time you have some climate-related disaster, you have deluded leftists pointing out global warming. No. The people of New Orleans had been warned for decades that the seawall was grossly inadequate. They were living on borrowed time until that time ran out. We have efficient ways of managing environment emergencies, right? Building up the seawalls. The sewer system in New Orleans, experts had been warning for significant periods of time that it was woefully inadequate and needed serious attention. Once again, living on borrowed time. Now, we can mitigate, because we have technology and we have resources to mitigate climate emergencies, and they needn't turn into the disasters that they have been by virtue of inattention and neglect. And we need fossil fuel use. We need to stop pretending that this green energy is abundant and available. If everybody ran out today and bought an electric car, well, there wouldn't be enough lithium batteries to manufacture all of those cars. But let's imagine for a moment they could. Where would this electricity come from? There simply would not be enough electricity. And as the Midwest is recognizing that they can't power what they need to now. They have more energy need than they have supply. And this was absolutely artificially created emergency. So anyways, those are some kind of quick thoughts on this climate-related nonsense. What you've been told is a lie. This climate alarmism is an attempt to get you to act. The problem is when you act as though it's an emergency, when it's not an emergency, you will take steps that are drastic, irresponsible, and have not second or third order consequences, first order consequences that are absolutely disastrous. I don't speak about this in my book, Deconstructing Social Justice, because at the time I didn't have the insight, I didn't have the time to research into these issues at depth. I have since. I'm fully confident on everything I've said to you. But I gave you the names of a few titles, and Unsettled, What Climate Alarmist Science Tells Us, What It Doesn't and Why It Matters by Stephen E. Koonin. It's an excellent book for kind of less in-depth, fine-grained analysis. There's Apocalypse Never and what is the other one? The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. Both excellent books. I do hope you'll check out my book, Deconstructing Social Justice, available on Amazon. Not important because I wrote it. I wrote it because the issues are deeply important. Thank you very much for your time. And please drop a thumbs up. And I hope you subscribe. Thanks so much for your time. Bye-bye.